Samantha, can you see my slides?
We are. That's all good, Taslim.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this very cold evening. So today we're going to be going through a journey on headaches in pregnancy, and the aim of this talk is to give you a practical approach to the management in pregnancy. So the first half of the talk is going to focus on the clinical approach and causes, as well as the management of primary and secondary headaches. And then the second half of the talk is going to go through a few interesting cases, and then a little bit about meningiomas in pregnancy. So headaches is a common complaint and may have many causes. Most patients presenting with a headache do not have severe underlying structural diseases, but it is important to consider this possibility. It's a very challenging symptom to discuss and itself can be a headache, and there's so many etiologies ranging from benign to life-threatening. So the aim of my talk is for you to be able to answer this question confidently at the end of the talk. And that is, what do you do when you find yourself standing in front of a patient complaining of a headache? So the first step is to distinguish, is this a primary headache or is this a secondary headache? A primary headache is essentially when the pain is the disease, and a secondary headache is when the pain is a symptom of another disease. You'll find yourself in three scenarios. The first scenario is you have a patient that suffers from a primary headache, and she now presents to you with a usual headache that she's had pre-pregnancy to your antenatal clinic. Secondly, she may not have ever suffered from a headache before, and she now presents to you with her first severe headache during pregnancy. And then lastly, she suffers from a primary headache before pregnancy, but now the pain is different. It's different in quality, intensity, or associated symptoms. Like with clinical medicine, a comprehensive history and clinical examination should never be replaced by any diagnostic tool. A good history should cover all the points that clearly define the pattern of the headache. So essentially, at the end of your history taking, you need to have a mental picture of the patient's life before the onset of the headache versus after. So this slide just depicts how comprehensive your headache history should be. So the duration and course of the headache will provide a guide to the underlying cause. A new headache is more likely than a chronic headache to reflect underlying intracranial disease, whereas a long history of a chronic headache without any other symptoms usually is associated with unlikely to reflect any serious disease. The sudden development of a severe headache in a previously well patient is more ominous and may be caused by intracranial abnormality. The headache characteristics itself is also very important. So you want to know about the quality. Is it sudden? Is it throbbing? Or is it just a tight pressure sensation? And is there any associated symptoms in the form of prodromal symptoms, for example, fatigue and cravings, or any aura symptoms, for example, nausea, vomiting, photophobia, or sensitivity to sound or smells? You want to know if there's any precipitating factors, any relieving factors, and has she received any previous treatment before? So evaluation of a patient with a headache should demand a full general and urological examination, as well as fundoscopy and an assessment of the mental state. It's important that whenever you are seeing a patient with a headache in your antenatal clinic, you should never shortchange the brain and eye. So essentially, the aim of your history and examination is to determine, does your patient have any red flags and should you be investigating this headache further? Or does your patient have green flags and are you reassured that this is just a simple primary headache? So red flags can be differentiated into history and examination. So on history, if your patient has a thunderclap headache, any focal symptoms, any non-focal symptoms, a headache that has changed in quality, intensity, or symptoms, a headache that disturbs your sleep will suggest more likely an underlying structural lesion, as do exertional headaches and late onset paroxysmal headaches. Any headache that changes with posture or is exacerbated by Valsalva or associated with jaw claudication should raise alarm bells. Any patient with risk factors for cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, for example, if she has an underlying thrombophilia. And then on examination, if you have any abnormal neurological examination or any headache that is accompanied by systemic signs such as pyrexia, neck stiffness, rash, and any headache in a patient with cancer or any underlying immunodeficiency may point to a structural lesion or infection. Then you have your green flags. So this is a patient that had a previous history of a migraine. She can either have a migraine with an aura. So an aura is basically a headache that is preceded by any visual, sensory, or motor symptoms, and this can affect up to 20% of patients with migraine. Typical aura symptoms should last between 5 and 60 minutes. Any prolonged aura that is not fully reversible is not normal and needs to be investigated further. Any migraine that is prolonged for more than 72 hours is not normal and needs to be investigated further. So essentially, you want to group your patients into either primary headache syndrome or secondary headache syndrome. And the rest of the talk is going to be going in through these differential diagnoses. So let's delve into scenario 1. So you have a patient that suffers from a primary headache, and she now presents to you with the usual headache to your antenatal clinic. So your patient most likely has a primary headache syndrome, common types being tension type headaches and migrainous headaches, uncommonly being cluster type headaches. So a migraine is mostly unilateral. It's usually described as a pulsating headache, moderate to severe, meaning that it prevents her from leaving her house or bed. 75% of patients will have a prodrome in the form of fatigue and cravings, and 25% will have an aura, either before or during the headache, and in the form of nausea, vomiting most commonly, but also photophobia and phenopia, as well as neurological symptoms. Typically, a migraine should not last more than 3 days. A tension type headache, for example, doesn't have any associated symptoms. It's essentially just a headache. It can last the whole day. It's usually worse in the evening, and it's usually described as a tight quality, and it can often be accompanied by poor concentration and dizziness. A cluster headache is, as the name says, it can come in clusters, it can come on alternate days, and it can recur even weeks to years apart. It's usually described as a stabbing, excruciating, extremely severe pain that is unilateral, orbital or supraorbital, with ipsilateral autonomic symptoms. It usually is associated with no aura or prodrome. So for the sake of the talk, I'm going to be going through migraines in pregnancy in a little bit more detail, as this is the most commonest type of headaches we see, and it is the most important cause of headaches amongst women of childbearing age. So during pregnancy, the estradiol levels are up to 100 times higher than a normal cyclical woman. About 90% of women suffering from a migraine without an aura will report improvement of their migrainous attacks, and this is especially in the second and third trimester of their pregnancy. In up to 20%, the attacks may even disappear completely during the pregnancy. Estrogen levels will increase during each trimester, and this negatively correlates with the migrainous incidence. It is suggested that the absence of fluctuations in estradiol levels are responsible for the decrease in migrainous frequency during pregnancy. Migraine attacks with an aura, on the other hand, will more often remain the same or worsen compared to those without an aura. It's important to note that up to 20% of all women that suffer from a migraine will relapse during the first week postpartum. So looking at the adverse effects of migraines in pregnancy, we always like to work systematically, looking at maternal and fetal complications. So if you think about it logically, if you have a migraine with an aura, the most common complaint will be nausea and vomiting. If your patient has excessive nausea and vomiting, this will result in dehydration that puts her at the increased risk of venous thromboembolism and electrolyte abnormalities. And this will most likely require IV rehydration and IV replacement and hospitalization. Migraines itself carries a threefold increased risk of preeclampsia and hypertensive disorders, as well as its complications. It's often described as moderate to severe, meaning that it prevents the patient from getting out of bed. So you have an increased risk of migraine-related absenteeism in both school and work. It carries an increased risk of maternal mental health complications with comorbidities such as depression, and this can occur both antenatally and postpartum. For the fetus, it carries an increased risk of low birth weight, preterm birth, as well as longer neonatal ICU admissions, respiratory distress, and febrile seizures. So this is a nice little diagram, flow diagram, looking essentially a summarized version of how you should manage a patient with a primary headache in pregnancy. So your first line of thought will be, is your patient able to tolerate oral fluids? Because they will most often have nausea and vomiting. If she's able to tolerate oral fluids, your first line will be a simple analgesic, for example, paracetamol, with the addition of caffeine. So caffeine is seen as an effective migraine abortive. If your patient is unable to tolerate oral fluids, you would have to do your electrolytes and admit your patient for IV hydration. And then you would add metoclopramide, so an antiemetic, as well as an antihistamine, and most commonly we use diphenhydramine. Metoclopramide is seen as an effective migraine abortive. If this improves your headache within 60 minutes, you may keep your patient in your hospital for a few hours, and then you can observe her. If the headache completely resolves or there's minimal residual headache, you can discharge your patient home with a trial of oral paracetamol. If the headache improved, but there's still a moderate to residual headache left over, you may repeat your dose of metoclopramide and diphenhydramine. And if it then completely resolved, you can safely discharge your patient home. But if the headache does not improve with this, you would then consider second line in the form of triptans, and I'll be going through this in a bit detail in the next few slides. If you're admitting your patient or discharging your patient home after she requires second line treatment, it's a good idea to discharge her with a low dose, short course of prednisone to prevent recurrence. Importantly, in the second trimester, to limit the course of non-steroidals, as we know that after 32 weeks, it can result in closure of your patent ductus arteriosus, and you may use IV magnesium as an addition. So this is a few polls that I've come across in the literature. So ideally, patients with migraines, especially migraines with aura, should be managed preconceptually and optimized preconceptually, and always have a multidisciplinary team approach with your friendly neurologist. So we like to have a biopsychosocial approach to these patients. So optimize the patient's routine, make sure they have adequate sleep, adequate hydration, a good diet, and good exercise. And comorbidities such as depression require special consideration. So involve your social worker, involve your psychologist or your psychiatrist, and think about additional things such as cognitive behavioral therapy, meditation, relaxation, and acupuncture. It's important to keep an eye on your liver function tests with repeated paracetamol use, as it is very easy for a pregnant patient to go into liver failure due to paracetamol toxicity. It's important to limit your caffeine use to less than 200 milligrams a day, as it does carry an increased risk of neonatal cardiac arrhythmias. I'll go through the prescription treatment in the next few slides, but as you know, it is quite understudied in the literature, but it does not mean that we don't treat migraines. We are lacking in data, especially the long-term neurodevelopmental data, but this will require prospective trials as well as randomized control trials, which we know is not really a reality in the pregnant population. And most safety data that we have available are retrospective. So firstly, I'm going to be going through the prescription treatment. So abortives. So abortives are essentially medications that you use as needed for a headache. And first line simple analgesics that we use is paracetamol. It's important to know that the number needed to treat is 12 in order to effectively treat a headache. So we like to add antiemetics and antihistamines to the first line treatment. Lidocaine can be used as part of anesthetic nerve blocks done by the neurologist, and I'll be going through that in the next few slides. Triptans are migraine-specific medications that are used as needed within 30 to 60 minutes after the onset of the headache. And we use sumatriptan specifically as it has the most safety data available in pregnancy. So essentially what a triptan is a serotonin agonist. So it inhibits the release of inflammatory peptides. It comes in various formulations, but we like to use the subcutaneous route as it avoids the GIT and is more tolerable. 80% of patients will have relief at 2 hours after using a triptan. They might require a second dose. So the subcutaneous dose usually comes in a 6 milligram formulation, and your maximum dose you can use in 24 hours is 12 milligrams. And always consider addition of steroids to reduce the recurrence, a short dose, low course of steroids. So the safety data of triptans comes in the form of a large meta-analysis that was done in 2015 looking at 4,000 infants, and they found no increased risk of congenital malformations, preterm birth, miscarriage, and adverse outcomes. And they specifically looked at infants that had in utero exposure of triptans. The long-term data that we have available comes from a Norwegian study that looked at children 5 years after in utero exposure of triptans, and they found no negative developmental concerns. However, there was an increased association with first trimester miscarriages, so it's still cautioned to use it sparingly in the first trimester. Secondly, I'm going to be going through preventatives. So preventatives are essentially medications that we use every day to reduce the frequency and disability associated with migraines. So it's based on scoring systems, and it's based on a frequency of more than 4 headaches a month that reduces the quality of life. So the first line treatment will be a beta blocker, and beta blockers essentially work by inhibiting the action of endogenous catecholamines. We use propranolol specifically because it has the most safety data available, but we know it carries an increased risk of fetal growth restriction. Second line treatment comes in the form of your tricyclic antidepressants. And again, we use amitriptyline specifically because it has the most safety data. And this works by inhibiting the transportation of serotonin. And we have 3 randomized controlled trials that confirms its efficacy. It's important to note that it does carry a risk of neonatal abstinence syndrome, so it's important to inform neonatology at birth. Vitamins can be used in the form of magnesium and vitamin B2, and it essentially works by altering the energy metabolism and neuronal excitatory pathways, and this can safely be used orally at a daily dose. Third line is in the form of venlafaxine, which is an SNRI, and it works by inhibiting serotonin pathways, but there is inconsistent data of its efficacy across studies, so it is reserved for third-line treatment. Then lastly, procedures, which is done by neurology using lidocaine and anesthetic nerve blocks if all of the above fails. It's done as an outpatient procedure, and it can be safely done in pregnancy, and it can be repeated every few weeks of the treatment. Okay, so now we've gone through primary headaches and its management. So now we're going to be going on to the big guns. So secondary headaches. So essentially this will be in a patient that presents to you with the first severe headache during pregnancy, or a patient that has previously suffered from a primary headache, but now the pain is different. It's different in quality, intensity, or associated symptoms. So secondary headaches can be divided into mass-occupying lesions, hemorrhages in the form of epidural and subdural hemorrhages, and this is usually as a result of trauma or falls, and you'll get this from your history. Subarachnoid hemorrhages are almost always due to aneurysmal rupture. Intraparenchymal hemorrhages are almost always due to hypertensive bleeds, and interventricular hemorrhages are almost always associated with infarcts. Any type of intracranial tumor can appear during the gestational period. Pituitary adenomas, meningiomas, and vascular malformations have been known to exhibit relapses in relation to pregnancy, with symptoms developing or rapidly worsening during gestation. Important to consider other CNS pathology such as infection, specifically looking at meningitis, encephalitis, or cerebral malaria, thrombosis, vascular and idiopathic intracranial hypertension, also known as pseudotumor cerebri syndrome. But never forget about disorders external to the central nervous system. For example, acute sinusitis, preeclampsia, eclampsia, and analgesic overuse. So the first question you need to answer when you see a patient with a secondary headache is, what is your initial diagnostic choice? Are you going to image first, or is it safe to do a lumbar puncture? So if you have a patient on history that has an abrupt onset thunderclap headache, and history with a headache that has positional association, if the headache occurs soon after waking or awakes the patient from sleep, if the headache is precipitated by Valsalva or progressively worsening over time, or any focal neurological symptoms, if on examination she has hypertension with bradycardia, evidence of papilledema, neck stiffness, visual changes, or any focal neurological deficits, you would first do neuroimaging before performing a lumbar puncture. If you have a history of trauma, a non-contrasted CT rapid assessment will be your first line of choice to exclude skull fractures, traumatic brain injuries, and epidural or subdural hematomas. If you have a patient on history with any of the red flags and you suspect intracranial disease, then the need for CT or MRI and examination of the CSF must be decided on an individual basis. MRI is more sensitive for the diagnosis of an intracranial tumor. It is safe in the pregnant population with no exposure to radiation. Cerebral venous sinus thrombosis is an important consideration in a patient with a headache, and an MRI should include evaluation of your venous sinuses, and this does not require IV contrast. If you have a patient that presents with pyrexia and meningeal signs with any abnormal neurological examination symptoms or signs, you would first perform a rapid CT head before performing a lumbar puncture. A lumbar puncture is absolutely contraindicated in a patient with a known or suspected intracranial mass or any signs and symptoms of intracranial hypertension. Acute sinusitis will typically produce a localized throbbing headache accompanied by sinal tenderness, and the relationship of the symptoms to your infection, and if you have any radiological findings, will permit the diagnosis to be made with confidence, and treatment will be directed at underlying infection. So bloods are really helpful unless you have a leukocytosis, but it's important if you are administering contrast that you do check your baseline renal functions, as contrast-induced nephropathy is a complication. So for example, if you have a patient with a sudden severe headache with signs of meningeal irritation in the form of neck stiffness without pyrexia, your first line imaging will be a CT scan of the head. If you have a patient with associated pyrexia, headache, and neck stiffness, you would consider meningitis, and you would specifically look for any signs of raised intracranial pressure, specifically papilledema. If there's any signs of raised intracranial pressure, you would do a CT scan before you're performing a lumbar puncture. It's important to note that lumbar punctures are not contraindicated in pregnancy. Lastly, if you have a patient with a headache and any signs and symptoms of raised intracranial pressure with papilledema, you should always consider cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. So you would consider CT with addition of a venogram or an MRI with addition of a venogram. If your imaging is normal, then you can consider lumbar puncture to look at the CSF composition. And most importantly, whenever you are doing a lumbar puncture in a pregnant patient, to always look at the opening pressure, as idiopathic intracranial hypertension is a diagnosis of exclusion. So this is a nice little table that I took from the ACOG practice guideline, looking at the secondary headache types that we see. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm not going to be going in through preeclampsia and posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome, but it's important to remember that headaches can be a symptom of preeclampsia, and the measurement of the blood pressure and urine protein is an important consideration. The rest of the differential diagnoses I'm going to be going through in the next few slides, and we're going to learn by looking at case examples. So firstly, I have a patient that comes in with a thunderclap headache. It can be one of the most scariest headaches that you see. So essentially, it's usually described as a headache that has maximum intensity within 60 seconds and a duration of at least 5 minutes. And it's typically described by the patient as the worst headache ever. Main differential diagnosis will be a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Reversible cerebral vasoconstriction syndrome is rare, and your patient will usually present with a recurrent attack of thunderclap headaches over a few days, and they may have associated nausea, vomiting, and focal neurological deficits. Pituitary apoplexy can present with a sudden onset severe headache, followed by nausea, vomiting, and visual disturbances, and the initial presentation can mimic a subarachnoid hemorrhage. It's caused by a hemorrhage into a macroadenoma of the pituitary gland, and the diagnosis can be challenging because it is very easily missed on a head CT. It's very rare for an ischemic stroke to just present with a headache. An arterial dissection, specifically of the carotid artery, can happen, but it is rare in pregnancy. So the first case that I'm going to be going through is a 34-year-old female that we had. She was 29 weeks pregnant, and she presented with a thunderclap headache, neck stiffness, and vomiting. So you can see there are multiple red flags, and your first line of diagnosis will be a CT scan. So you can see on the CT brain the typical Death Star appearance that we see. And basically what we are seeing is dense material in the basal cisterns and fissures, and this is due to acute bleeding into the subarachnoid space. The blood in the subarachnoid space can fill or partly fill the sulci, fissures, basal cisterns, and ventricles. So it's important that once you diagnose a subarachnoid hemorrhage, you need to call your friendly neurosurgeon. The diagnosis is an urgent diagnosis, and it's almost always due to a ruptured aneurysm. Other causes can include a ruptured AV malformation or hypertension. The initial investigation in all patients suspected of having a subarachnoid hemorrhage is a CT scan of the head. However, the accuracy is influenced by the amount of subarachnoid blood and the interval between the onset of symptoms and the time of scanning. So as time passes, the blood will spread away from the bleeding site, and hemolysis will impede the detection of the blood on the CT scan even within hours. If you have a patient that presents with a thunderclap headache and a normal level of consciousness and no focal deficits, a normal head CT performed within 6 hours is sufficient enough to exclude a subarachnoid hemorrhage. If the CT scan is normal and your patient has presented more than 6 hours after the onset of headache, you can perform a lumbar puncture looking for the blood breakdown products in your CSF. Importantly, once a subarachnoid hemorrhage is diagnosed, your further investigation is focused on the detection of an aneurysm, as this is found in up to 90% of cases. CT angiography is currently the most feasible investigation to start with in pregnancy. So it's very important to diagnose aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhages, as it carries a very high maternal mortality rate and perinatal mortality rate. So the maternal mortality rate in the first world countries is up to 50%. So you can imagine how high it will be in a third world country. So the risk of aneurysmal subarachnoid hemorrhage was previously believed to be increased during pregnancy, but recent studies have shown no increased association between pregnancy or delivery and the risk of rupture, and the rates are comparable to the rates in the general population. If it is going to bleed, it's more likely to bleed in the latter half of the pregnancy, and it's important once it ruptures, obliterative treatment in the form of surgical clipping or coiling should not be delayed for the delivery of the fetus. And basic fundamentals of avoiding maternal hypoxemia, hypotension, and acid-base changes will remain the top priority. So the third case we're going to be going through is a 29-year-old patient. She's 8 weeks pregnant. We have a scan on picture A confirming an intrauterine singleton pregnancy. And she now presents to you with nausea, vomiting, and a persistent headache for 1 week prior to admission. Because of the severe nausea and vomiting in pregnancy at the appropriate gestation, she was initially diagnosed and managed as hyperemesis gravidarum. But plot twist, 3 days after admission, she developed a new left-sided motor weakness. So on the picture on the right, you can see an MR angiography with imaging of the venous sinuses, and we can see the demonstration of the absence of flow in the occluded venous sinus as depicted by the arrow. The cerebral venous sinus thrombosis essentially occurs when you have a blood clot that forms in the brain's venous sinus, and this prevents the blood from draining out of the brain. It's rare, but it's a serious cause of headaches. Risk factors will include a cesarean section delivery, infection, vomiting, and anemia, with the highest incidence being in the 3rd trimester and up to 4 weeks postpartum. The headache is the most common presenting symptom and is present in up to 90% of these patients, with a typical evolving neurological examination. It's important that once you diagnose it, that you need to investigate for an underlying thrombophilia, most commonly antiphospholipid syndrome, as we know this will have implications for following pregnancy. MRI venography is the neuroimaging of choice, and first-line treatment is anticoagulation for the average of 6 months using low molecular weight heparin, as this has been shown to reduce mortality and have better functional outcomes reported in the literature. If your patient doesn't improve with first-line treatment, or if she has ongoing neurological symptoms, second-line treatment will be in the form of mechanical thrombectomy. The risk of recurrence in a next pregnancy is 1%, but your patient will require prophylactic low molecular weight heparin throughout her next pregnancy. Then lastly, what conditions should you never forget about? If you have a patient that presents to you with bilateral papilledema, a headache, a normal CT brain, typically an obese patient, a normal CSF composition, but you were clever and you did the opening pressure and the opening pressure was high. So your diagnosis will be pseudotumor cerebri syndrome. So the exact mechanism of the rise in CSF pressure is still unknown, but proposed theories include reduced CSF absorption and increased cerebral venous pressure. Other possible causes include intracranial venous hypertension and abnormal vitamin A metabolism. As you can see in the table on the left, there's a multitude of conditions and drugs that has been associated with raised intracranial pressure, and you can see a lot of common things such as obesity, renal failure, and anemia that we actually see in pregnancy. So it's important once you have a patient with papilledema, it should be confirmed by an experienced clinician, specifically ophthalmology, using dilated fundoscopy. Always check your blood pressure and then image your brain as soon as possible. If there's no identifiable lesions, you would perform a lumbar puncture. And like I said, always do an opening pressure. If it's more than 25 centimeters with no secondary causes found, your diagnosis will be idiopathic intracranial hypertension. So once it's diagnosed in the pregnancy, you would have a multidisciplinary team approach. And it's important to include your ophthalmologist to monitor your visual fields and visual acuity at least once every trimester, as there is a small risk of optic nerve infarction. Very importantly, to limit the weight gain in pregnancy, as there is a relationship between weight gain, obesity, and the development of idiopathic intracranial hypertension, and this is well established clinically and in the literature. Your diuretic of choice will be acetazolamide, and it has been studied in pregnant women, and the teratogenicity is not greater than the general population. So essentially what it is an oral carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. This has been the mainstay of treatment for decades. Repeated lumbar punctures can be used as a temporizing measure in patients who have progressive visual loss despite medical therapy until a permanent shunt can be placed post-delivery. Surgical management is indicated for patients with progressive visual loss despite maximum medical therapy, and the decision will be based on your local protocols. If you're unlucky and you have a patient that is in the 10% of cases that has their vision threatened, you would need to decide, is the pregnancy viable or not? You would then consider delivery and neurosurgical intervention as a sequential procedure if you have a viable pregnancy, especially after 32 weeks. It's important to involve your multidisciplinary team, so involve your neurosurgeons, your anesthetists, and your maternal fetal medicine subspecialists. Delivery will be via cesarean section under general anesthetic, with the CSF diversion procedure done after your cesarean section. If you have uncomplicated idiopathic intracranial hypertension, as the condition tends to improve after delivery, a medical termination is often not necessary. There's no specific obstetric complications, and subsequent pregnancies are not risk factors for recurrence. If there is a concern for vision loss during the second stage, you may expedite delivery using a low outlet forceps. If cesarean section is indicated, it should be done under general anesthetic. Then lastly, you should always have the conversation about safety of investigations with your patient, especially if you are consenting your patient for the specific investigation. So the accepted background cumulative dose of ionizing radiation during pregnancy is 50 micrograys, and the fetal exposure for a CT scan of the head is less than 0.05 micrograys. The risk of neonatal thyroid dysfunction with iodinated contrast has not been proven in vivo, but it's important to always use suitable abdominal protection or shielding during the CT scan. A non-contrasted MRI is safe, and a lumbar puncture is safe in pregnancy where brain imaging allows. Women in the postnatal period will be investigated as for the non-pregnant population. Then lastly, I just wanted to mention meningiomas in pregnancy, as we have been seeing quite a lot of cases, and we have seen that it has gotten a lot of attention in the media recently. So it is the most common primary brain tumor in females. It's mostly benign, and there is a paucity of information on the diagnosis and management of meningiomas during and after pregnancy. We know that diagnosis is mainly made with an MRI. Growth and symptomatology of these tumors is attributed to the endocrine environment and increased perfusion during pregnancy, with expression of progesterone and other hormone receptors on these tumors. The primary symptom that patients usually will present with is a first onset headache or worsening headache in pregnancy, but they may present with anosmia and visual loss. The management will require an individualized, multidisciplinary approach based on the symptom, size, and location of the tumor, as well as the gestational age of the pregnancy. In principle, like always, elective surgery should be performed in the second trimester or postponed until after delivery. So this is a clinical case that we've recently come across in our maternal medicine clinic. So we had a 35-year-old female. She had a previous vaginal delivery and a previous uneventful second trimester miscarriage. She now presented incidentally with persistent bitemporal headaches that got progressively worse in the pregnancy, as well as a short history of anosmia and photophobia. So you can see alarm bells ringing already. The multidisciplinary team workup revealed normal visual fields, but bilateral papilledema was present. Neuroimaging showed an olfactory groove meningioma with surrounding vasogenic edema. After counseling and a multidisciplinary team discussion with our neurosurgeons and ophthalmologists, a combined decision was made for expectant management with symptomatic relief of the headaches and very close monitoring of the visual fields, with specific endpoints for delivery and urgent neurosurgical intervention. The patient remained stable and she was delivered by cesarean section due to the presence of known raised intracranial pressure at 38 weeks gestation. This is her MRI showing an olfactory groove meningioma measured 4 by 5 centimeters with surrounding vasogenic edema. The postpartum course was complicated by hypertension and generalized tonic-clonic seizures, and she was diagnosed with eclampsia and magnesium sulfate was administered, as well as long-term seizure prophylaxis using carbamazepine. The patient was safely discharged on day 5 postpartum, and a repeat MRI 3 months postpartum showed interval growth of the tumor with a locally aggressive olfactory groove meningioma with mass effect on both frontal lobes. The tumor was fully resected via craniotomy 5 months after delivery, with histology confirming a WHO grade 1 meningioma and follow-up MRI confirmed complete resection. And subsequently, this patient has normal vision and normal pituitary function with no recurrence of her meningioma and a beautiful baby boy. So if you want to read a little bit more about how we managed a case series and how we managed pregnant patients that presented with severe headaches that ended up having meningiomas, we recently published this case series in the South African Medical Journal in the May issue. This year. So take-home messages. So a clinical history and examination should never ever be replaced by any special investigation. Always take note of the 3 scenarios and see in which scenario does your patient fit. Does your patient have any red flags? Is this a primary headache or is this a secondary headache? And know when you should investigate further and which diagnostic investigative tools you should use. Always have the conversation about imaging in pregnancy and its safety with your patients. And lastly, don't forget brain tumors. Thank you.
Thank you, Tasleem. So that was an extremely comprehensive take on headaches in pregnancy. So maybe while we just await, we welcome actually any questions, comments from our audience. And maybe while we wait to just take a question, or not actually see questions are starting to come in. But I think for me, you clearly mentioned the red flags, which are extremely important. I also think it's quite concerning when somebody mentions it to more than one person or mentions it twice to you that I have a headache. And if they've seen more than one healthcare provider and they report the headache, I think no matter how well the patient appears, we have seen that patients can deteriorate quite rapidly. So I think that's really important to factor in it. And just as everybody does know, Dr. Jared Zamparini, he's the president of SUMSA, and you can see that he's joined us as well. So maybe just while I actually have the both of you and before I actually take any questions, you did touch on it, but just so that we're all clear about it, we have a patient admitted with a suspicion of meningitis. So you do the history, take the history, do the examination, and there's no localizing or any focal signs. You do a fundoscopy and nothing to suggest that there's raised intracranial pressure. Can you safely proceed with a lumbar puncture without first having imaging?
Sorry, Samantha, I think I was cut off. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, just if you had a patient where you suspect meningitis and your clinical examination doesn't have any focal neurology, and you have a normal fundoscopy, is it safe? Is it okay to proceed with a lumbar puncture?
Yes, so it is safe if you have no focal signs or symptoms of raised intracranial pressure and no papilledema, then it is safe to perform a lumbar puncture first. Yeah.
Yeah, because I do very often, or have come often, where nobody wants to do the lumbar puncture unless there's imaging first. Jared, do you have an opinion on that, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it depends on your resources. In that, in an ideal world, everyone should get a scan before they have a lumbar puncture. But we obviously don't work in an ideal world, and I think if there's nothing focal and you're quite comfortable, obviously in rare cases something's going to happen. But the benefit of diagnosing the meningitis and treating the meningitis is going to outweigh the low risk, especially if you've managed to do fundoscopy. So I think if you're really worried, if there's no focal signs and you're still worried and you do fundoscopy and there's no papilledema, no signs of raised intracranial pressure, then you can. And what you can also do, what the emergency medicine guys are doing quite a lot nowadays is optic nerve ultrasound. And so they actually just pop a probe on your eye and measure the optic nerve. And that gives you quite a good idea of intracranial pressure. It's quite a good marker. So if you have a friendly emergency medicine person around, you can ask them to come pop a probe on if you really need to. Because you've got lots of probes in the obstetric wards.
Yes, we do.
Ultrasound probes in the obstetric wards.
Great. Thanks for that, Jared. I mean, I agree with you completely. I mean, we generally are sitting even in places with the most amount of resources at a tertiary center with lists of patients waiting, while we have a patient that's perhaps not receiving the care they should because we are waiting for imaging. Okay, maybe I should move on to some questions from our audience. So, maybe Taslim, for you, a patient with a normal blood pressure, and with a headache, can we exclude preeclampsia?
I think you can safely exclude preeclampsia if you have a normal blood pressure with no proteinuria and a headache. It is common to have preeclampsia presenting with a headache, but you have to have hypertension to diagnose preeclampsia. So I think it will be safe. If you are not sure, if you have a patient that has risk factors for preeclampsia and you want to be safe, you can admit the patient for 24-hour blood pressure profile and administer magnesium sulfate. And after that, if your patient has completely normal blood pressures with no other signs of any other end organ dysfunction, then I think you can safely exclude preeclampsia and look for other causes.
Thanks. Okay, so maybe either one of you can maybe tell us what your approach is. How do you actually approach a woman who is post cesarean section? Well, actually, I suppose if you're well enough to be in the private sector, post vaginal delivery, dural puncture, headache. What would be your approach? Maybe Taslim, you want to start?
So I think firstly, IV rehydration. And then start with simple analgesics in the form of paracetamol. You can always upscale to oral tramadol or IV morphine. And then caffeine has been proven to improve post-dural puncture headaches. So you can either give it in the form of an oral caffeine tablet. You can give the patient a strong cup of coffee. You can even give the patient a Red Bull if you have. If that does not improve, then you need to discuss with your anesthesiologist for a post-dural epidural patch. That should be done in theatre. Yeah.
Anything to add to that, Jared?
No, nothing to add. I mean, that's pretty much covers it.
Yeah, good. The next question, so far all our questions have been from anonymous attendees. If a patient presents with a severe headache and hypertension secondary to sympathetic pain response in migraines, what do you do?
I think I'll give this to Jared.
So I think that is a tricky one, and I think one thing is it depends on your blood pressure. If this patient's coming in with a blood pressure of 180 over 100, it's unlikely to be pain pushing up your blood pressure to that degree. And then you've got to start thinking that it's the blood pressure causing the headache. But if you have a mild response and your headache's, 140 over 90, 145, 95, and there's a headache, and there's no other signs to suggest hypertension as your primary problem, I think in that patient, you should still work them up, or at least the way I would approach it is still work them up as pregnancy-induced hypertension or preeclampsia, and treat the pain in the meantime, whether you're using paracetamol or another analgesic. And if the pain responds and the blood pressure goes down, and then you get your urine protein is normal and there's no liver dysfunction, your platelets are fine, everything else is fine, and the blood pressure doesn't recur with treating the headache, then I think you've treated the blood pressure by treating the headache. But obviously, if you then stop the analgesia and the blood pressure the hypertension comes back, then maybe it is more, and the pain comes back and the hypertension comes back, then maybe it is more a pain response. But I think the bottom line is you shouldn't see this massively raised blood pressure. It might be slightly elevated, but you should still then watch out for, is there something underlying that the baseline blood pressure was a little bit high to start with, and that pushed up the blood pressure.
Yeah, actually, I can't agree with that more, Jared. I think we tend to, maybe if we looked at from high-income countries, we probably are overly put in surveillance of preeclampsia. But I suppose we live in such an environment in which we have much higher incidence of preeclampsia and much higher complications with extremely high morbidity and mortality rates. So I think in any patient, and as you said, it's even in the milder forms, you'd rather over-investigate and put in the extra surveillance than miss the preeclampsia. because that can have quite devastating outcome for the patient. So always have an extremely high index of suspicion, and do whatever needs to be done in that circumstances to exclude preeclampsia. So now we have, I'm not familiar with this, but maybe one of you have come across it. It says, thanks for an excellent talk. Any opinion on the Nerivio, I think it's Nerivio device for treatment of migraine in pregnancy? I'm not familiar with it. I'm not sure if either one of you.
Yeah, so the Nerivio is essentially an electromodulator device, and it gets put onto your arm, and the best use is at the onset of migraine. And it basically, I mean, to put it in simple terms, it stimulates nerve fibers in your upper arm. It triggers a pain inhibitory response, and then that has been shown. It's something it's called conditioned pain modulation. And essentially, by triggering other peripheral nerves, that neuromodulator then activates your pain response, and it helps treat the migraine. So it sounds like pseudoscience and hoodoo, but it really does work, and there's good evidence for it. There's a small study. Look, it was done by the company, but it was published in Headache. I can find the link and share it. And it did show benefit in pregnancy, and safety in pregnancy. So I think if a patient has responded well to it, and if they're looking for drug-free treatment, and as much as we can say the triptans are safe from these Norwegian or Swedish registry studies, if patients are really against using medical therapy, then the Nerivio is quite a useful device. Some medical aids will pay for it. We obviously don't have it available in state. Some medical aids will pay for it. And like I said, it has been shown to have benefit.
Okay, so maybe one last question. The use of ergotamine in acute management of migraines.
Yeah, so ergotamine preparations are contraindicated in pregnancy because it can cause uterine contraction and result in early trimester miscarriages or preterm delivery. So it is contraindicated in pregnancy. I see there's a question about why did the patient with the meningioma was treated as an eclamptic. So this patient was in our high care postpartum, and common things occur commonly. The patient had hypertension with new onset seizures. So we treated her for both. So we treated her as if she has eclampsia, because we know the maternal mortality with untreated eclampsia without magnesium sulfate is high. But we did also give her seizure prophylaxis with carbamazepine. So we basically covered our bases both ways. I know it was most likely the space occupying lesion that caused the seizure, but common things occur commonly, and that's why we treated her as such.
Okay, one last one, which I think might be also a little bit of a tricky one to answer. I'm not sure if we know the answer.
Before you go to that one, I don't know if you've seen there's one comment or a question in the chat about the role of physiotherapy for the MDT in helping patients alleviating possible tension in conjunction with first-line therapy. I've definitely got an opinion on this. I don't know, Tasleem, if you have an opinion. Sorry to hijack the role of chair, Sam.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I know definitely we should be treating these patients with a biopsychosocial approach. So there is definitely room for physiotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, meditation, relaxation, and additional things. I'm not sure about the evidence for its use, but I think it should be used, and there is a role for it in the management. I'm not sure if you agree with me.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, in clinical practice, I think there's such a huge role for physio. And what I've found often in patients with migraine who are pregnant, pregnant women with migraine, is you get stuck in this vicious cycle of the migraine causes stress, you develop a tension headache, which worsens the migraine, which worsens the stress. And patients come in with their necks are solid just from the tension. And they've got this unilateral migraine headache, this additional band sort of occipital headache, and the physio really helps, whether it's laser, ultrasound, just massage and strapping. I think there's such a huge role for it, and we, especially in state practice, I think we forget about the role of physio and OT and obviously the MDT team. I think it's such an important role. So yeah, don't forget to include everyone else.
Yes, I think we are almost reaching the end of our session. I think we will take note of the rest of the questions, and maybe Taslim and Jared will respond to them, perhaps in an email. Just remember, we urge all of you, please, to become members of SUMSA, because then we can probably bring you more frequent webinars of this nature and help spread the knowledge. And I want to just thank everyone, Taslim, Jared, for giving us this opportunity, and to all the delegates that joined tonight. It was an amazing talk. I'm just going to hand over to Jared for a quick reminder of what's coming up in the next few months. Thank you.
So thanks, Sam, and thank you, Taslim. That was an excellent talk. It's such a common problem, and I think we often brush it off when we've got serious things going on and patients to treat, that the headache becomes a bit of a side thing that we do forget about. But on that note and other things to talk about, just want to remind everyone of the FIGO World Congress that is coming to Cape Town in October. SUMSA is a daughter society of SASOG, so we're very proud to be involved in FIGO. And I'd like to encourage everyone, after you've joined SUMSA, of course, as Sam has encouraged you, to then go over to the FIGO website and have a look. We are running a pre-Congress workshop called Clinical Cases and Emerging Innovations in Obstetric Medicine. It's on the 4th of October, which is a Saturday, from 2 to 5:30, and it's at the Convention Center, so it's right there. We're going to be looking at models for collaborative care, so looking at how they do it in Australia and the UK, involving physicians, maternal fetal medicine, and everyone together in providing care, and then two sets of interactive cases. We have an excellent panel, so we have 9 excellent speakers and me from 6 different countries, including India, the UK, Australia, Singapore, Canada, and of course, South Africa. So we'd encourage everyone to join. And if you want to take out your phone now, you can scan that QR code. The workshop is in collaboration with the International Society of Obstetric Medicine, and then the local societies from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and North America. But if you scan that QR code, it'll take you to the registration page. So if you haven't registered already, please do so. And if you have registered already, please just add the workshop to your registration. We look forward to having you there and hearing from our international experts and local experts as well. Thanks, everyone. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great night, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar and then at FIGO. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thanks.
everyone.
Great.